Captain Rebecca Stone had been flying commercial airlines for 12 years. Her colleagues often joked about why such a beautiful, successful woman never dated anyone. They assumed she was too focused on her career, too picky, or maybe just unlucky in love. None of them suspected the real reason. The last man she had trusted with her heart had tried to kill her at. Rebecca Stone was everything you'd want in an airline pilot: professional, calm under pressure, with an impeccable safety record that made passengers feel secure the moment they heard her voice over the intercom. At 38, she had the kind of competence that came from thousands of flight hours and the respect of every crew member who worked with her. She was also strikingly beautiful in an understated way, with auburn hair always pulled back in a regulation bun and green eyes that seemed to see everything. What puzzled her colleagues at Atlantic Airways was her complete lack of interest in romantic relationships. In 12 years of flying together, none of them had ever seen her on a date. She politely declined every invitation from co-pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew members. When asked about her personal life, she would smile and change the subject with practiced ease. The truth was far more complicated and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Rebecca Stone wasn't just an airline pilot. She was a former United States Air Force major who had flown combat missions in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. More importantly, she was a woman whose trust had been shattered in the most violent way possible by someone she had loved completely. The story begins in 2006, when Rebecca was known as Major Rebecca Stone, one of the Air Force's most promising young pilots. She flew F-16 Fighting Falcons out of Balad Air Base in Iraq, providing close air support for ground troops and conducting reconnaissance missions over hostile territory. Her call sign was Phoenix, earned after she successfully completed a mission despite taking heavy anti-aircraft fire that should have brought down her aircraft. Which city in the world are you watching this video from today? Rebecca's squadron was tight-knit, bound together by the unique brotherhood that develops among people who risk their lives together daily. Among her fellow pilots was Captain Marcus Webb, a charismatic F-15 pilot whose confidence in the cockpit was matched only by his charm on the ground. Marcus had joined the squadron 6 months after Rebecca, and from their first meeting, there had been an undeniable connection between them. Military regulations prohibited romantic relationships between officers in the same unit, but the connection between Rebecca and Marcus transcended simple attraction. They understood each other in ways that civilians never could. They had both experienced the rush of aerial combat, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and the weight of responsibility that came with flying multi-million-dollar aircraft in defense of their country. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully. Conversations that started about mission parameters evolved into discussions about life after the military. Professional respect grew into deep admiration, and admiration eventually became love. They were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries in public, but in private moments between missions, they began planning a future that would extend beyond their deployment. Marcus talked about leaving the military after his current tour and pursuing commercial aviation. Rebecca had similar thoughts, though she was considering staying in the Air Force for a full 20-year career. They discussed marriage, children, and the kind of life they could build together once they returned to civilian life. For the first time since joining the military, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine a future that included personal happiness alongside professional achievement. The relationship remained secret for 8 months, hidden from commanding officers and fellow pilots who would have been required to report it if they had known. Rebecca and Marcus were both too professional to allow their personal feelings to interfere with their duties, and their mission performance remained exemplary throughout their involvement. The end came suddenly and without warning. In March 2008, Rebecca and Marcus were assigned to a joint mission supporting a special operations rescue operation in the mountains of northern Iraq. Intelligence reports indicated that a Navy SEAL team had been compromised during a reconnaissance mission and needed immediate extraction under fire. Rebecca and Marcus would provide air cover while helicopters moved in to retrieve the stranded personnel. The mission briefing revealed details that should have remained classified. The SEAL team had been gathering intelligence on a high-value target suspected of funding terrorist operations throughout the region. More critically, they had discovered evidence of weapons transfers that implicated several American military contractors in illegal arms sales to insurgent groups. Rebecca noticed that Marcus seemed unusually tense during the briefing, asking detailed questions about the intelligence the SEAL team had gathered and the specific location where they would be extracted. She attributed his concern to the dangerous nature of the mission and the high stakes involved in rescuing American Special Operations personnel. The mission launched at dawn, with Rebecca and Marcus flying in formation toward the extraction zone. Radio communications were kept to a minimum due to the risk of enemy interception, but Rebecca could see Marcus's aircraft clearly in the early morning light. Everything appeared normal as they approached the target area. The extraction zone was a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountains, terrain that made both the rescue helicopters and the covering aircraft vulnerable to ground fire. As they began their approach, Rebecca received radio confirmation that the SEAL team was in position and ready for pickup. The helicopters were minutes away from beginning the extraction. That's when everything went wrong. Marcus's aircraft suddenly broke formation and began descending toward the valley at an aggressive angle that violated their mission parameters. Rebecca attempted to contact him over the radio, but received no response. She assumed he had spotted enemy positions that posed a threat to the extraction and was moving to neutralize them. Instead, Marcus opened fire on the SEAL team's position. His 20-millimeter cannon rounds tore through the rocky outcropping where the Special Operations personnel had taken cover, forcing them to abandon their defensive positions and exposing them to enemy fire from the surrounding ridges. The extraction helicopters, seeing the chaos below, aborted their approach and requested immediate clarification of the situation. Rebecca realized with horror that Marcus was deliberately attacking American forces. She tried repeatedly to contact him over the radio, demanding that he explain his actions and cease fire immediately. When he finally responded, his voice was cold and unfamiliar. Marcus informed her that the SEAL team had gathered evidence that would implicate him in the weapons trafficking operation they had been investigating. He had been selling classified information about American military movements to insurgent groups, allowing them to position weapons caches and plan attacks with devastating effectiveness. The intelligence the SEALs had discovered would expose his involvement and result in charges of treason. Rebecca was stunned by the revelation that the man she loved and trusted had been betraying their country and their fellow service members for months, but there was no time to process the emotional impact of his betrayal. The SEAL team was pinned down by enemy fire, the extraction helicopters couldn't approach safely, and Marcus was preparing to make another attack run to ensure that no American personnel survived to report what they had discovered. Rebecca faced an impossible choice. She could attempt to disable Marcus's aircraft, potentially killing the man she loved, but saving the lives of the Special Operations team. Or she could allow him to complete his attack, preserving their relationship, but becoming complicit in the murder of American military personnel. The decision took less than 3 seconds. Rebecca armed her own weapon systems and moved into an attack position behind Marcus's F-15. She gave him one final warning over the radio, informing him that she would fire if he did not immediately cease his attack on American forces and return to base. Marcus's response was to begin another attack run on the SEAL team's position. Rebecca locked onto his aircraft with her targeting system and fired a single IM-9 Sidewinder missile. The heat-seeking weapon tracked perfectly to its target, striking Marcus's F-15 in the engine compartment and causing it to explode in a fireball that lit up the dawn sky. Rebecca watched the aircraft she had destroyed fall toward the valley floor, knowing that she had just killed the only man she had ever truly loved. There was no time for grief or regret. The SEAL team was still under fire, and the extraction helicopters needed immediate support to complete their mission. Rebecca spent the next 20 minutes providing close air support, using her cannon and remaining missiles to suppress enemy positions and clear a path for the rescue helicopters. The extraction was ultimately successful, with all Special Operations personnel recovered safely. The intelligence they had gathered led to the arrest of 17 individuals involved in illegal weapons trafficking, preventing further attacks on American forces. The official report of the incident classified Marcus's actions as the result of enemy infiltration of secure communications, suggesting that insurgents had somehow gained control of his aircraft systems and forced him to attack American positions. Rebecca's decision to shoot down his F-15 was presented as quick thinking that prevented further casualties from this unprecedented form of cyber warfare. Only a handful of people knew the truth about Marcus's betrayal and Rebecca's terrible choice. The Air Force leadership decided that revealing the facts would damage morale and provide propaganda opportunities for enemy forces. Rebecca was quietly awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the mission, though the citation made no mention of shooting down an American aircraft or the circumstances that had made it necessary. The psychological impact of the incident was severe and lasting. Rebecca had not only lost the man she loved, but had been forced to kill him with her own hands to prevent him from murdering fellow Americans. The betrayal cut deeper than the violence, destroying her ability to trust her own judgment about people and relationships. Rebecca completed her deployment and returned to the United States with an exemplary service record and commendations for exceptional performance under combat conditions. But she had changed in ways that were not immediately apparent to her superiors or colleagues. The confident, outgoing pilot who had deployed to Iraq returned as someone more guarded and solitary. She applied for early separation from the Air Force 18 months after returning from deployment, citing a desire to pursue opportunities in civilian aviation. Her request was approved without question, given her distinguished service record and the psychological pressures associated with combat duty. The Air Force was accustomed to losing talented personnel who found it difficult to readjust to peacetime military service. Rebecca's transition to commercial aviation was smooth from a technical standpoint. Her military experience made her highly qualified for airline positions, and her combat record impressed hiring managers who understood the unique skills that military pilots brought to civilian aviation. She was hired by Atlantic Airways within 6 months of leaving the Air Force and quickly established herself as one of their most reliable and skilled pilots. But the personal cost of her military service continued to affect every aspect of her civilian life. Rebecca found it impossible to form meaningful relationships with colleagues who had not shared similar experiences. More critically, she discovered that she could no longer trust her instincts about people, particularly men who showed romantic interest. The memory of Marcus's betrayal haunted every interaction with potential partners. Men who seemed charming and trustworthy reminded her of how wrong she had been about someone she thought she knew completely. She began to see potential deception in every friendly gesture and hidden motives in every invitation. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat became a barrier to normal human connection in civilian life. Rebecca's colleagues at Atlantic Airways noticed her isolation, but attributed it to the natural reserve that many former military personnel displayed when transitioning to civilian careers. They respected her professionalism and didn't push for personal information she clearly preferred not to share. Over time, her lack of romantic relationships became simply another characteristic of a pilot who was dedicated to her work above all else. The routine of commercial aviation provided Rebecca with the structure and purpose she needed to function effectively despite her emotional wounds. Flying passenger aircraft was far less dangerous than combat missions, but it still required the same attention to detail and calm decision-making that had made her successful in the military. She found satisfaction in safely transporting hundreds of passengers to their destinations, though the work lacked the intensity and importance of her military service. For 12 years, Rebecca maintained this carefully controlled existence. She lived alone in a small apartment near the airport, socialized only with colleagues during required company events, and spent her free time reading technical manuals or working out at the gym. She dated no one, formed no close friendships, and kept her past so private that most people assumed she had simply chosen career over family. The carefully constructed walls Rebecca had built around her emotional life might have remained intact indefinitely, if not for Flight 47 on a gray Tuesday morning in November. The flight from New York to London was routine in every way, with 243 passengers and a crew that Rebecca had worked with dozens of times before. The weather was clear, the aircraft was performing normally, and the passenger manifest showed nothing unusual. But 45 minutes into the flight, everything changed. Three men in different parts of the cabin stood up simultaneously and revealed weapons that had somehow passed through airport security. They moved with military precision, clearly trained and organized in a way that distinguished them from typical hijackers motivated by desperation or ideology. Rebecca received word of the hijacking through a coded message from the senior flight attendant, transmitted through the aircraft's internal communication system. The hijackers had not yet attempted to breach the cockpit, but they had taken control of the passenger cabin and were making demands that suggested sophisticated planning and inside knowledge of airline security procedures. As Rebecca processed the situation and began following established protocols for dealing with hijacking attempts, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. The lead hijacker's voice, transmitted through the cabin's public address system, had a distinctive accent and speech pattern that seemed familiar. She listened carefully as he announced the hijacker's demands and threats, trying to place where she might have heard that voice before. Recognition came suddenly and with terrifying clarity. The voice belonged to Captain Ahmed Rashid, a former Iraqi Air Force pilot who had worked as a liaison with American forces during Rebecca's deployment. She had met him several times during joint operations planning sessions and had found him professional and seemingly committed to the cooperative relationship between Iraqi and American military forces. But Rebecca now remembered intelligence reports that had surfaced after her deployment ended. Captain Rashid had been suspected of providing information to insurgent groups about American aircraft movements and patrol patterns. The reports had been inconclusive, and Rashid had disappeared before he could be questioned or arrested. Apparently, he had eventually made his way to the United States and had been planning this operation for years. The realization that she was facing an enemy from her combat past transformed Rebecca's approach to the crisis. This was no longer a routine hijacking by desperate criminals. This was a continuation of the war she had fought in Iraq, brought to American civilian airspace by someone who knew her military background and might have specifically chosen this flight because of her presence. Rebecca's training and combat experience took over. She began evaluating the situation with the tactical mindset that had kept her alive during dozens of dangerous missions. The hijackers had made a critical error by not immediately seizing control of the cockpit. This suggested they were either overconfident or following a plan that required the aircraft to remain on its current flight path for reasons she didn't yet understand. She considered the possibility that this was a suicide mission designed to crash the aircraft into a target in London. But the hijackers' behavior suggested they intended to land the plane and use the passengers as hostages for some larger objective. Either way, Rebecca knew that following standard airline procedures for dealing with hijackers would likely result in catastrophic casualties. Rebecca made a decision that would have been impossible for a pilot without combat experience. Instead of complying with the hijackers' demands or attempting to negotiate, she would use the aircraft itself as a weapon against them. The plan was extremely dangerous and violated every protocol in commercial aviation, but it was the only option that gave the passengers and crew a realistic chance of survival. Rebecca began a series of aggressive maneuvers that no passenger aircraft should ever attempt at cruising altitude. She rolled the Boeing 777 into a steep dive, then pulled up sharply, creating forces that threw anyone not properly secured against the cabin walls and ceiling. The hijackers, who had been moving through the aisles with weapons drawn, were slammed into seats and bulkheads with enough force to incapacitate them. The maneuvers continued for several minutes, with Rebecca using her knowledge of aerobatics and combat flying to create conditions that made it impossible for the hijackers to maintain control of the passenger cabin. The passengers, though terrified by the violent motion of the aircraft, remained secured in their seats by safety belts that the hijackers had not bothered to unfasten. When Rebecca finally leveled the aircraft, flight attendants were able to secure the hijackers' weapons and restrain them with the help of passengers who had realized what was happening. The leader, Captain Rashid, was unconscious from a head injury sustained when he was thrown against a galley counter during one of Rebecca's maneuvers. Rebecca immediately contacted air traffic control and requested priority landing at the nearest suitable airport. She reported the attempted hijacking and requested law enforcement and medical personnel to meet the aircraft upon landing. The remainder of the flight proceeded without incident, though many passengers required medical attention for injuries sustained during the aggressive maneuvering. The investigation that followed revealed the scope of the hijackers' plan and Rebecca's role in preventing a major terrorist attack. Captain Rashid and his associates had intended to crash Flight 4047 into the Houses of Parliament during a joint session, potentially killing hundreds of British government officials and devastating the UK's political leadership. The FBI and British intelligence services discovered that the hijacking was part of a larger network of revenge attacks planned by former Iraqi military personnel who blamed American and British forces for the destruction of their country. Rebecca's presence on the flight had been coincidental, but her combat experience and recognition of the lead hijacker had been crucial factors in preventing the attack. The media coverage of the incident focused on Rebecca's heroic actions and extraordinary flying skills, but she refused most interview requests and declined to discuss the details of how she had recognized the hijackers or why she had chosen such an unconventional response to the situation. The airline and government officials respected her privacy and limited public statements to praising her professionalism and quick thinking. But the incident had profound effects on Rebecca's carefully controlled emotional life. For the first time in years, she had been forced to rely on combat skills and tactical thinking that connected her directly to her military service and the traumatic loss of Marcus. The successful resolution of the hijacking proved that her abilities and judgment remained sound, despite the self-doubt that had plagued her since his betrayal. More importantly, the incident brought Rebecca into contact with Dr. James Mitchell, a trauma psychologist who specialized in treating military veterans and first responders. Mitchell was brought in to provide counseling for the flight crew following the hijacking, and his approach to trauma therapy was specifically designed for people whose professional duties had exposed them to life-threatening situations. For the first time since leaving the Air Force, Rebecca found herself talking to someone who understood the unique psychological pressures faced by people in high-stakes professions. Dr. Mitchell didn't try to minimize her experiences or suggest that she should simply move on from past traumas. Instead, he helped her understand how her military service had shaped her responses to trust and relationships. The therapy sessions revealed that Rebecca's isolation wasn't just about Marcus's betrayal, though that remained the central trauma that affected her ability to form new relationships. Her entire military career had required her to compartmentalize emotions and maintain professional distance from colleagues who might be killed or wounded at any time. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat had become a barrier to normal human connection in civilian life. Dr. Mitchell helped Rebecca understand that her response to Marcus's betrayal had been appropriate and necessary, even though it had come at enormous personal cost. She had chosen to protect innocent lives over preserving a relationship with someone who had revealed himself to be fundamentally different from the person she thought she knew. The decision had been correct, but the emotional impact had never been properly processed or resolved. Working with Dr. Mitchell, Rebecca began to distinguish between reasonable caution in relationships and the excessive defensiveness that had kept her isolated for over a decade. She learned techniques for managing the hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax around other people and strategies for recognizing when her military training was interfering with civilian social interactions. The process was slow and often painful, requiring Rebecca to confront emotions and memories she had suppressed for years. But gradually, she began to develop a more nuanced understanding of trust and vulnerability. She realized that Marcus's betrayal had been an extreme situation that didn't necessarily predict how other relationships might develop. 6 months after the hijacking incident, Rebecca made her first tentative steps toward rebuilding a social life. She began accepting invitations to company social events and engaging in conversations that went beyond professional topics. She started dating casually, though she remained cautious about revealing too much about her military background or the reasons for her previous isolation. The first man she dated seriously was Captain David Torres, a former Navy pilot who had transitioned to commercial aviation after completing his military service. David understood the challenges of military to civilian transition and didn't push Rebecca for details about her past that she wasn't ready to share. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared professional experiences rather than intense romantic passion. Rebecca found that her relationship with David allowed her to practice the trust-building skills she was learning in therapy without the overwhelming vulnerability that had characterized her relationship with Marcus. David was patient with her need for emotional distance and understanding when military experiences occasionally influenced her reactions to civilian situations. After a year of dating, Rebecca and David began discussing more serious commitment. Rebecca realized that her feelings for David, while genuine, were quite different from the intense connection she had felt with Marcus. The relationship was stable and comfortable rather than passionate and consuming, which initially disappointed her but eventually came to appreciate as a healthier foundation for long-term partnership. Rebecca's colleagues at Atlantic Airways noticed the changes in her demeanor and social engagement. She seemed more relaxed during crew meetings and more willing to participate in conversations that weren't strictly work-related. Several people commented that she appeared happier and more approachable than she had been in all the years they had known her. The transformation wasn't complete or without setbacks. Rebecca still experienced moments of intense suspicion when David's behavior seemed inconsistent or when she couldn't account for his whereabouts during their time apart. She sometimes found herself analyzing his words for hidden meanings or testing his reactions to gauge his honesty about minor matters. But with Dr. Mitchell's continued support and David's patient understanding, Rebecca gradually learned to distinguish between reasonable relationship caution and trauma-driven hypervigilance. She developed strategies for communicating her concerns directly rather than withdrawing emotionally when she felt uncertain about David's motivations or intentions. 2 years after the hijacking incident, Rebecca and David were married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family members. Rebecca's parents, who had never understood why their accomplished daughter had remained single for so long, were relieved to see her building the kind of personal life they had always hoped she would find. Rebecca never told David the complete truth about Marcus and the circumstances that had led to her years of isolation. Some details of her military service remained classified, and others were simply too painful to share even with someone she trusted completely. But she was able to explain enough about her combat experiences and the challenges of military to civilian transition to help him understand her occasional struggles with trust and intimacy. The marriage wasn't perfect, and Rebecca continued working with Dr. Mitchell to address ongoing effects of her military trauma. But she had learned that healing didn't require forgetting the past or pretending that her experiences hadn't shaped her approach to relationships. Instead, she had found ways to honor the lessons learned from her military service while building new connections based on honesty and mutual support. Rebecca continued flying for Atlantic Airways, though she eventually moved into training and safety roles that allowed her to share her expertise with younger pilots. Her experience with the hijacking incident made her a valuable resource for developing security protocols and emergency response procedures. She never spoke publicly about the specific details of her military service or the personal costs of her combat deployments, but she became an advocate for better mental health resources for military veterans transitioning to civilian careers, particularly those in high-responsibility professions like aviation, where past trauma could affect current performance. Rebecca's story illustrates the complex ways that military service can affect personal relationships and the long process of healing that many veterans experience when transitioning to civilian life. Her 12 years of isolation weren't a sign of weakness or inability to adapt, but rather a natural response to trauma that required professional support and personal commitment to overcome. The colleagues who had once joked about Rebecca's single status never learned the real reasons for her reluctance to date or the extraordinary experiences that had shaped her approach to trust and vulnerability. They saw only the successful resolution of her personal struggles and the happiness she eventually found with David. Some secrets are too complex and painful to share with casual acquaintances, but that doesn't diminish their importance in shaping who we become. Rebecca Stone learned that healing from trauma doesn't require forgetting the past or pretending that difficult experiences didn't happen. Instead, it requires finding ways to integrate those experiences into a life that includes both professional achievement and personal fulfillment. The pilot who had once trusted completely and paid a terrible price for that trust eventually learned to trust again, but with the wisdom that comes from understanding both the risks and rewards of human connection. Her story reminds us that the people we work with every day may be carrying experiences and wounds that are invisible to us, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in avoiding vulnerability, but in learning to embrace it despite the risks involved.